and admit all. Here we go. Morning, William. Morning, Kevin. Morning, Peter. Morning, Tom. Morning, Charles. Morning, Peter. Morning, Sue. Morning, John. Thanks for joining. Great to see you all. If you have just joined, if you could mute, please, that would be great. Peter, if you could mute, that'd be great.
Trying to.
There you go. Thank you. Thanks, Peter. That's great. Dennis Leach is coming in. Morning, Dennis. And that is good. Excellent.
Can I just apologise? I'm going to have to slip away before too long, but I wanted to join on.
Oh, thank you, Maggie. Thank you for joining. We love to have you on. And I know you're very busy with the AMNT. I think that's the correct. Is that still their name? I mean, just in case the name hasn't changed recently.
No, that's it. That's who we are.
Well, there we go. Excellent. Brilliant. Okay, excellent. Right. Okay. Morning, everybody. Welcome to this week's session on Pension Playpen. We're delighted to have Sahil Shah speaking on climate change and tipping points. I think is one of the key themes. So, as usual, we are recording. So, can we have thumbs up for everybody that we're recording? Everybody happy to be recorded? Obviously, the video will be up on Pension Playpen later today. And if you want to ask any questions, then we're very happy to interact and have a hand raised. You can ask Sahil a question. We've also got Bobby Ridaway helping Sahil because Bobby set Sahil up for this. So Bobby's in the background to help with any questions as well. So Sahil, do you want to introduce yourself and I'll pass over to you.
Thanks. Thanks, Steve, and thanks everyone so much for being here. I'm Sahil. I'm one of the co-founders of Tipping Frontier. I'm just going to share a tab and see if this works. Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yep, that's fine.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So I'm Sahil. I'm one of the co-founders of Tipping Frontier. We're mainly a climate risk modeling company. We do quite a lot of training as well. We train teams at places like the IMF and the World Bank. We've developed scenarios for the government here. Also currently doing some work with the Reserve Bank of India and helping them design climate damage functions. And we have a real focus on basically extending beyond direct damage from climate risks. So generally, when people will talk to you about climate change and the impact of climate change and how to assess it, they'll talk about the direct impacts to assets. That could be bridges, buildings, hospitals, schools, whatever. But the way it's assessed is generally the asset damage. But the broader impacts are much greater. I'll move on to climate tipping points in a moment, but I wanted to talk about cascading systemic risks initially, and then I will come back to elements of this later as well, because we do a lot of work around critical infrastructure failure from climate events and the implications for all of this. And cascading systemic risks are really just the knock-on effects and the knock-on effects. It's the type of thing where you can have drought. Drought can have impacts on water insecurity. That can lead to things like rationing, or it can lead to lower crop yields, huge increases in inflation. That can lead to things like food riots. There's a really wide variety of way in terms of how these risks unfold. And this is something that we helped put together a little while ago, which sort of really looks through a wide array of different impact pathways we call on how different climate hazards have different impacts. And generally what you'll see is direct damage, but there are so many different impacts, and I'll focus on a few. We do quite a lot of work on water scarcity and work on loss of infrastructure. But we'll also touch upon ecosystems when we go into climate tipping points and even impacts on labour productivity that can have major impacts too. And that comes through to everything from health impacts through to GDP loss and business interruption that we'll have quite a strong focus on today. And that can lead to everything from market destabilization right through to trade impacts, trade conflicts, and supply chain impacts, and we'll cover quite a bit of supply chain today, and sort of going further along from those lines. And this is just an example scenario that we put together some time ago, actually the earlier days of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. We previously did some work on climate change and agricultural risk, and when basically modeling what was known as multiple breadbasket failure in terms of multiple major climate hazards in different breadbaskets of the world, how that could basically then lead to major supply chain impacts, especially around what are called supply chain choke points, like the Suez Canal. And it's likely that we'll see a lot more of these in upcoming years. And I'll move a little bit more later on to that sort of climate conflict nexus and some of the downstream and cascading impacts. But before that, I wanted to go through a few different areas of climate tipping points, because these are basically major tipping points in the environment that we see. And what a tipping point basically is it's something once we go past, we can no longer reverse it, and it has major knock-on effects on the environment and on human systems as well. That's both in the short run and for some of them much more so in the long run. So we're actually called Tipping Frontier because we named ourselves the frontier that goes along across all of the different tipping points. And as far as the RCPs in this diagram go, we are currently on track sort of between RCP 4.5 and RCP 6. And that means that we are on track by the end of the 21st century to actually cross quite a few of these different tipping points. And those are the ones that I'll run through today. So a couple that we've already crossed and some that we will then cross in upcoming years. And just in terms of warming, I think current policy set us on track for about 2.7 degrees. And we're on track for sort of that range between 2.5 to 2.9. Although the last estimates on this were done last year before the new US administration, and it's entirely possible that that will be slightly higher now, and that's before we even take into account some of the feedback loops. So the first tipping point I wanted to touch upon was low latitude coral reefs. Low latitude coral reefs, things like the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, which is probably the best known, but sort of sit all across the world. And the die-off of these coral reefs is estimated between sort of 1.2 and 1.5 degrees. So this is one that we've almost certainly already crossed, and if we haven't, we'll imminently cross it. And there's basically a 10-year time frame between when we cross that point and when we see major impacts. And you might be looking at this and thinking, why do coral reefs really matter? The reason they matter is that coral cover actually provides basically ecological niches for between 1 and 9 million species of fish. And the job estimates for the impact on fisheries alone and then tourism are expected to be in the hundreds of millions. We're still yet to see sort of strong models that are able to take this through to GDP loss, but sort of going back to where they're located can tell you sort of where you'll see those major losses, particularly in parts of the Caribbean and across a lot of Southeast Asia and Northern Australia too. And next is the Greenland Iceland sheet, and that's sort of between, it's a 1.5 degree median. 3 degrees will definitely have passed it and 2 degrees highly likely. So this one is pretty catastrophic. However, the impacts are felt over a very long time frame. So this kind of unfolds over 1,000 to 15,000 years. So you might think it doesn't matter, but if it does, it basically means we'd have a 20-foot sea level rise, and huge amounts of the world that are currently above above water will then be underwater.
Have we got a question from Tom?
Sure.
Hi, thanks. Sorry, Sahil, I just wanted to come back on the coral reef question that you raised there, the bleaching, because look, I'm not an expert and I just read what I read, but what I've read is that in recent years the coral reefs have massively recovered, and that the bleaching that we saw maybe 10 years ago has very significantly diminished, and the Great Barrier Reef in particular is looking pretty healthy these days. And I guess my other question on that is, we know that in times past the oceans have been a lot warmer than they are today, and the coral reefs seem to cope pretty well with that. So you highlighted that as a risk. I'd just like you to kind of address those points I made there. I'm not clear that it is a risk.
Sure. So I guess there's sort of two major impacts. So one is the temperature impact. The other impact that's quite significant on coral reefs is basically the ocean acidification that we're seeing as well. And when we saw previous warming to the same extent, we didn't see as much acidification. And you're right, there are certain subsets where we have seen quite good recovery. We've generally seen that because of sort of very specific, quite intensive biodiversity recovery efforts, where sort of large efforts have basically been put into particular subsets of coral reefs in some parts of the world. If we look along the full set of coral reefs across sort of between both lines of tropics, then we are seeing quite significant impacts already, would be my short answer to it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Yes, and sort of moving back onto the ice sheet. So after the Greenland ice sheet, we have the West Antarctic ice sheet, which again sort of sits between that 1.5 to 3 degree threshold in terms of it being bleached when it would melt. The impacts are felt over sort of 500 to 13,000 years, with sort of major impacts for 1,000 years. So still quite a while away, although not quite as long as Greenland. And the reason that this matters is, again, not just the sea level rise, but it would contribute to the collapse of the Antarctic ocean circulation. And basically, this would lead to a large decline in nutrients and fisheries across the whole southern hemisphere. And what we would also see is there's the Thwaites Glacier as well. And we would basically see the melting of the West Antarctic ice sheet also sort of contribute to the melting of the Thwaites Glacier and sort of a few others in a similar region. So it would basically have sort of knock-on impacts for melting of other glaciers as well. The ice sheets are probably slightly less relevant in terms of the timescales you're looking at, and the other ones are sort of a much nearer term. So the next thing is something called boreal permafrost abrupt thaw. And basically this is where we have permafrost, so frozen ground. And when the ground is frozen, there are carbon-dense peatlands which are kept cool. And when that permafrost thaws, basically there are microbes and fungi that digest the dead plants and the organic matter in the soil. And not only does this release carbon dioxide, but it also releases quite a lot of methane and nitrous oxide as well. And this basically leads to quite substantive warming effect in the short run. And this is something, again, that we're seeing happening already in quite a few different parts of the world. And again, there's still high levels of uncertainty, especially with the methane, the extent to which we'll see short-term warming impacts. So this is quite a major one that we're seeing across parts of Latin America, especially in parts of Asia already. And again, I think we'll see sort of more of this across other parts of the Northern Hemisphere in upcoming years, probably especially in parts of Canada, the US, and Russia as well, when it comes to short-term warming impacts. And the reason that this matters is the more of this that we see, it basically leads to a positive feedback loop that we see more warming and then more tipping points. And sort of you kind of have this runaway impact that could be sort of very scary in terms of the impacts to human life and the economic impacts as well. And the next tipping point I wanted to touch upon was something called mountain glacier retreat. And mountain glacier retreat is basically to do with water security. So peak water is when glacier is basically melting and it produces the maximum volume of freshwater runoff. That then we basically would then see a decline in freshwater availability from that glacier. So it's thought that already a lot of small glaciers in Central Europe, Western Canada, Latin America, have already gone past what's called peak meltwater, and about 2 billion people, just under 2 billion people, including about 1 billion people, but around the glaciers of the Himalayas, Karakoram and Hindu Kush are extremely reliant upon these water sources. So one of the things that we're quite likely to see in upcoming years is sort of potential major impacts on water security from this. Again, if you're looking at the Himalayas as well as a major flashpoint, we're likely to see major second order impacts on both the relationship between India and Pakistan and India and China, where a lot of the border conflict between India and China is actually over strategic water resources used in either country. And again, to a certain extent, there are similarities of that between India and Pakistan as well, and conflict over water, to the extent to which in the recent skirmishes, we saw threats from India to basically turn off water sharing agreements from the Indus River Basin. And this is sort of one that we'd flag as quite concerning, not just for the initial impacts it would have, but the potential spillover impacts it could have on agriculture, global food prices, conflict, and so on, and something that could happen in single digit to low double digit years from now. And the next tipping point I wanted to touch upon was something called the subpolar Gaia. And the subpolar Gaia is basically a subcurrent within a wider current known as the Atlantic Meridian Ocean Circulation, which is basically the current that goes between here and the Arctic. And it's the reason basically why Britain is very far north, on a par with some parts of Russia and some parts of Canada, but faces a much, much milder climate, and is basically this current between that keeps Britain and other parts of Northwest Europe as warm as they are. And in terms of in terms of the SPG collapse, recent data has shown that there's basically a 50% likelihood that we'll pass this by 2040. If we do actually cross it, we have a air temperature drop of 2 to 3 degrees. That's more severe in the winter as well. And basically the cooling specifically will moderate warming across parts of Northwest Europe and Eastern Canada. We will likely also see increased precipitation and higher variability of precipitation. So we'll basically see more droughts and more flooding. And all of these impacts are significant, although less significant than that of the total collapse of the AMOC current. But if we do pass it, we kind of feel that on a 5 to 10 year frame. So it's really rapid onset, and it's the type of thing which could cause major stress to our electrical grids, huge impact on our groundwater availability, ability to extract groundwater, impacts on our agricultural yields. It would build up sea ice around ports, especially Scottish ports, and some of the northern ports for different parts of the year, which would make shipping a lot harder. And there'd be sort of a huge series of knock-on effects. And it's entirely possible that we would cross this tipping point and would see major impacts within the next 20 years, which sort of sits upon the timeframes that many of you invest on. And all of these tipping points that I've mentioned so far will be surpassed before we actually hit 2 degrees. And the rest I'll touch upon go beyond the 2 degrees threshold, which we are highly likely to go beyond in the not too distant future. So I wanted to run through some of those before. So the first one is Amazon dieback. And what Amazon dieback is basically the Amazon rainforest has a system where it creates and relies upon its own rainfall for survival. And what would happen is deforestation would lead to more drought. We're seeing with both deforestation and wildfires, and the Amazon dieback would basically transform the Amazon from a rainforest into a dry savanna. And it's a huge carbon store. So over 120 billion tons of carbon are actually stored within the vegetation and soil that could potentially die. And what we then would see is again, this is thought to happen over decades in terms of the total impact of this, but potentially this could occur within a 50-year window. And again, we'd like to hit this at around 3 to 3.5 degrees. And it's only about a 10% increase that we'd see in deforestation that would actually trigger it. And again, the implications on biodiversity are still poorly understood, but given that the Amazon roughly has about one out of every 4 species in the world, there would be huge implications on nature and downstream impacts on supply chains that we still don't yet fully understand and are sort of yet to be sort of really richly and fully studied. And next, I wanted to move on to the AMOC collapse. So I touched upon the subpolar Gaia, which is a subcurrent of the AMOC. And yeah, the AMOC collapse is a really wide range in terms of what we might see, at what particular point the current would slow down and then reverse, but it could be as low as 1.4 degrees. And the regional temperature drops are really substantive. So we're seeing sort of potential drops of temperature in the UK of up to 10 degrees, much more flash flooding, much more drought. And again, the sea ice impacts would be worse than that we saw in the previous ice age, in terms of the amount of ice and where it would cover. So that's really substantive. And again, it's pretty rapid onset as well. So similar to the subpolar Gaia, if it were to shut down, we would see impacts on a 5 to 10 year basis. We'd see a huge collapse in plankton as well. And would see sort of major impacts on ocean ecosystems as well. So a large, basically, drop in nutrient availability, and a big drop in ocean availability at below surface levels. So we'd see sort of similar to historical cases, sort of major mass extinction events in the marine environments, on basically that whole sort of AMOC area. And again, the second order impacts of those are very nascent, in terms of how well they've been studied and how much we know. And I wanted to move on to some nearer term impacts that we'll see with different acute climate related hazards, both here in the UK and in other parts of the world. And a lot of the work that we do sort of sits upon critical infrastructure failure, network effects, disruption, disaster recovery, and basically assessing these impacts from a climate standpoint. So critical infrastructure is often basically segmented into a variety of different sectors. The main ones that are particularly significant when it comes to climate events and the downstream impacts are transport, water and energy, which we focus on, but of course sort of critical manufacturing, health, chemicals, dams and food have sort of major downstream impacts as well. Communications, interestingly, is becoming slightly less vulnerable because of just the widespread use of satellites, and this is different in different locations depending upon reliance on different technology. And in terms of assessing historical climate impacts and models of future climate impacts, a large pathway through which we see impacts will come through critical infrastructure failure, and that runs through from economic activity right through to loss of life. And here's a very quick overview of how we actually build bespoke fragility curves to assess infrastructure vulnerability. So we look at everything from the dependencies. So what are the actual materials used? What are the infrastructure dependencies for that piece of infrastructure, the material inputs, labor, transportation? We do a lot of work looking at the actual engineering design. So what are the materials? What forces is it engineered to withstand? How old is it? Does it have reinforced foundations? What has the vulnerability and the exposure been like over time? How long was it actually built to last? What was the estimated drop in function over the life cycle? And this basically helps us build up a picture of the likelihood that different bits of critical infrastructure will fail in different cyclones or floods or heat waves or whatever else it may be. And then obviously when critical infrastructure fails, it doesn't just have an impact on that piece of infrastructure as well, but that cascades across networks. So let's say if a port is no longer functioning, that affects a lot of shipping. If roads can no longer function, then it reduces the capacity of, say, a city network for cars to go on it. Parts of the electrical grid don't work, then areas of the city or a region won't have any electricity. And just basically network models can be used to basically figure out if you have disruptions to particular nodes and edges, then how big of an impact does that actually have to the system? So I won't go into this in too much detail, but this is part of what we do, where we'll take a real world network, like a road network or electrical grid network. We will basically use computational modeling, and we'll then basically figure out how that actual disruption leads to macroeconomic losses. So how do you take the damage from that major climate event, figure out things like the rerouting and the disruption, and then basically put that into macroeconomic models, which can then be used to figure out what associated losses are, and actually on a much broader basis, what the actual benefits are of different adaptation measures that could be put into place. And the other big thing that obviously matters is how long that disruption duration lasts. So sometimes you can have something like a flood, and actually if the flood water recedes, then sometimes services self-recover, and we often see this with roads. So obviously if roads are submerged by water, you can't drive on them, but most flood water doesn't do that much damage to roads, and once the water is gone, it's fine. However, if you actually need to repair or even replace components, especially like fairly niche components for things like electrical grids, that can take quite a long time to actually figure out what it is that you need. Depends upon the supply chain availability, transport disruption, and because of this, sometimes we can see something like a major Category 5 cyclone in parts of the US actually have really long effects. And we had this with Cyclone Michael back in 2018. And we saw disruption in some of the worst hit areas for roughly 2 months. And when it comes to local businesses, especially businesses that don't have insurance, that can lead to large amounts of credit failure, loss of livelihoods, and sort of major long-term knock-on effects, even without taking into account things like reduced investments on that horizon. And again, this is just a little bit more about how we use sort of large varieties of data sets to basically validate the models that we have when it comes to those infrastructure failure cascades. And the final element I wanted to speak about was supply chain, because when sort of assessing the major economic impacts from climate events at a global level, we generally see this through major supply chain shocks. This is basically very dense, but what this is trying to say is most supply chain impacts are felt through ports, because ports have about 80% of trade. We're currently seeing much more exposure to extreme weather in parts of eastern China, which are disproportionately important when it comes to global shipping. And then again, once we start to look at particular ports, they have particular importance to certain supply chains, just when they play critical roles, either for things like critical raw minerals, intermediary goods, and it really depends. And the different ways in which you can start to look at the impact, whether it's the expected number of downtime days per year, and you can then look at the movement of ships, the movement of particular goods, and really start to look at which particular commodities it will then affect. And this is just basically a map that shows which particular supply chains are most exposed to port disruptions. I think big ones that would flag would be things such as the most at risk. So oil and gas is a really big one, mining and quarrying, especially in France. And there are some surprising ones as well. So stuff like the electrical and machinery impacts in the Philippines in terms of the most vulnerable large supply chains. And then, of course, there are other critical supply chains that I haven't spoken about, like semiconductors. And we look at ports such as those in Taiwan, which are highly vulnerable to cyclones, which could have sort of major global technological effects when it comes to things like the AI industry. So I've covered a lot of ground so far, but there's a lot of different risks involved, but I haven't really touched upon what pension funds really can do. And I'd say there's sort of 4 elements that we'd look at, which I put 3 here. So one is that better understanding of climate risk, and we can sort of help pension funds and pension trustees on this in terms of how do you actually understand what climate damage functions are. So that's basically how the impacts of climate change will unfold. And we're helping the Reserve Bank of India with this at the moment. How do you actually understand the chronic impacts, the acute impacts, and sort of what the likelihood of different types of events are, the more detailed implications of reaching different tipping points. And sort of that first part really comes from that situational awareness and understanding. And the next thing that we'd say is the work with the asset managers as well. So some asset managers are better than others when it comes to how do they actually assess physical risk and transition risk, both at an individual investment level, but I think we'd flag also at a portfolio level. We see many risk assessments that basically assess investment by investment, when the reality is when we see major climate events occur, there's a high correlation of damage and disruption across a wide set of assets, especially if they are geographically centralized. So basically looking at the different methodologies that asset managers are using, and not just how they're assessing risk, but other ways in which they're choosing to hedge it, whether it's through the geographical diversity, whether it's through elements of stewardship, however else they might be doing it, potentially even the use of climate insurance as well. And the other element that we'd flag is stewardship. So again, as I touched upon earlier, sort of climate events can have major downstream impacts. If you have a factory, for example, you can have your factory itself can be completely okay, but if you can't get workers to the factory, if you don't have electricity, if ports are down, it can have major downstream impacts. And the better prepared and the better you understand that type of thing, the more you're able to limit what that impact would be. So we see here that
Natalie's got a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you, Sahil. When you're talking about assessing asset managers, wonder whether you're bucketing as well in that category the index providers and the investment consultants, because generally, I mean, with the world going so much into passive, and generally, asset managers just having to replicate an index, I wonder what your thoughts are around the index providers who are designing the index and asset managers just having to sort of follow the index.
Yeah, I think I'd say what we're looking at would probably apply much more for the active world than it would for the passive world. If you're following an index, especially if it's index like the FTSE 100 or whatever it happens to be, you're actually very limited in how you're able to manage that exposure and how you're able to manage that risk. So if it is a passive index, there's limitations as to how well you're actually able to consider that risk, because the risk isn't really considered when it comes to the construction of that index in the first place.
Thank you. But I mean, the index providers are just often providing some indication of how they are assessing things as well. So it could be an interesting new journey for them as well.
Definitely. I think in terms of what we've seen from index providers, we will generally see asset location mapping. We will then see the overlay of basically risk heat maps and potentially natural hazard models and direct damage at an asset level. And that will basically then be built up across a set of assets to see where that potential impact could be. As I've run through, a relatively small proportion of overall climate impacts will be felt through direct damage to assets. But yes, I do think index providers would be useful to engage with to basically understand how those assessments will be developed and expanded at a full index level.
Yeah,
I think it's a really important point. Yeah.
thank you.
Patrick's got a question.
Sure.
Thank you. Natalie actually preempted part of my question, but you're saying here that people need to understand, assess their position, and then stewardship's important. We know all this. If we disregard the passive stuff, because many schemes can't do anything else and they will find it hard to move the needle, what do you think pension funds that have some agency in their investment plans can actually do that's going to make a difference? So they can actually then see this as something that they can do independently of everybody else. Many people are worried about being first movers or early adopters. Some of it's about mindset rather than just a capability.
Yeah. And I think there's sort of there are three things, and sort of two of them are here, and the one that I'd add. So I think one is asset manager choice. Because I did mention I won't name names of asset managers, but there are definitely some that we've come across that have quite robust climate risk assessments. These are done at a portfolio level. They know what the conditional value at risk would be, and that's taken into account when we're looking at potential losses for, say, a 1 in 10-year event or even a 1 in 25-year event that might be really relevant for the portfolio lifespan. So basically choosing and rewarding asset managers that take climate risk more seriously can help move the needle on the asset manager side of things. So we basically see more cultural change there. So I think that's a really important one. And I think signaling to the asset managers that they should be doing more in understanding, assessing, and hedging this risk is really important. At the same time, if there are particularly large holdings, direct holdings, for example, that might be done with particular corporates, whether that's on the equity side or the fixed income side, understanding that corporates have put the right types of contingency plans in place. So a lot of these will come through from how they plan for business disruption through to climate change, for supply chain risk that would see through climate change, moving beyond direct physical risk to also look at transition risk as well, how it comes to what the supply chains they will need of the future and how they'll ensure that actually be able to obtain the things like the components that they'll need. I think there's strong room for stewardship at the individual fund level where corporates can do a lot more in being prepared for different impacts of climate change. It can even be things like having backup generators at key facilities, which might not have been something worth investing in the future, but as we see more grid load, makes a lot of sense moving forward. And the final thing that I think would flag is basically looking at asset allocation, which I think is much harder at an individual fund level. I think more so at an industry level, going back to what I said about the cascading and systemic risk at the outset. A lot of the climate impacts and most vulnerable climate countries are in emerging markets, but through the impacts on things like disease, conflict, migration, supply chains, we'll start to see major impacts on Western economies as well. So I think the other really key piece of work to be done is what basically de-risking structures need to be put in place to also help the facilitation of those really key and core climate adaptation investments that need to be made in emerging markets. But I know that's not just a pension fund conversation. We need the DFIs and the MDBs involved to look at everything from governance risk, currency risk, all sorts of things.
Just on the small schemes point, Patrick, there's a lot of work going on to get all the small schemes quite a bit of powerful agency on stewardship, and we've got that work now on the radar of the regulator and of the DWP. So just watch this space on that one. Although there is quite a bit written about that because I've been talking about it for a couple of years. Tom.
Yeah, thanks. Sal, could you comment on the last month's Department of Energy report?
I had the chance to have a cursory review of it. I've not had the chance to review it in sufficient enough detail to have major comments on it.
Okay, so I did take the time to read it, and I'm just struck by it seems to refute a lot of what you're saying here, and I'm just slightly concerned. So, I mean, I'd really like you to respond to this, because you talked earlier on about the ice sheets and projected impacts between 1,000 and 15,000 years in the future. Well, 15,000 years ago, we were in the last ice age, so that seems like a pretty broad time frame to focus on. And there's quite a lot of uncertainty around things like you talked about the methane release from the permafrost. Well, I'm interested to what extent that's offset by the fact that the world's getting greener, and the one unexpected consequence, I mean, predictable but unexpected consequence of the increase in CO2 concentration is the increase in plant life, and how that affects your modeling. But I mean, the US report basically says the frequency and intensity of weather events is not something that's a major concern, and that CO2 warming appears to be less damaging economically than commonly believed. I mean, essentially, they're saying a lot of what you're saying is not something that we should be overly concerned about. It's not nothing, but it's not overly concerning. And I just wanted to pick up the language that you used when you talked about climate events. Surely that's a tautology. We can have weather events,
Yeah,
but a climate event is not a thing, right? So when you talk about climate insurance, surely you're talking about weather insurance, which sounds a lot less apocalyptic than climate events. So just interested in your thoughts on all of that. Thanks.
yeah. There's a few things that it's go in reverse order, and it's helpful to pick up. It's a shortening. So I think it's what I would call sort of climate-related natural hazards. So natural hazards where the frequency and intensity will increase with climate change. So I think these are extreme weather events, but it's climate-related natural hazard insurance. We are seeing increased frequency and intensity, and you can even look at numbers just from losses from the insurance industry, even if we're looking at insured losses, before we look at things like the increase in uninsurability. So I think if we're looking at the
sorry to interrupt you briefly, but I mean, there's a target effect consequence there, that the growth in human population and density of industrialization and urbanization inevitably leads to, you'd expect insurance claims to go up, right?
Yes, and what I was saying is we're seeing increased incidence. So we're seeing drought significantly more frequent and severe than we've seen before. The same would go for hurricanes, flooding, extreme heat, especially in Europe, which is heating up quicker than most other continents. There is sort of strong empirical evidence that we are seeing increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events across all parts of the globe. Okay,
the Department of Energy explicitly refutes that assertion. So I'd encourage you to read the report, because it's painting a very different kind of picture. And look, which is not to say, look, I've been up into the high mountains, I've seen the receding glaciers. That is a thing, and I get it. And I think your points around water scarcity are well made. I'm just struggling a bit with your predictions of the seas rising and drought and famine and fires and the apocalypse and so on.
I'd encourage you to have a read of the most recent IPCC report, if you haven't come across it.
I've read the summary, yeah.
Yeah, for the summary, yeah. So I think, yes, you are right in that the glacier effects are felt over a very long time. The two that I mentioned, one had a median impact of 1,000 years, one was considerably longer. So if we're looking at the things that we should be concerned about in the near and midterm, I agree with you that we're not going to see them have major impacts in our lifetimes or the next few sets of lifetimes. And it's a very long way away. In terms of some of the other impacts, we are aware of how much methane and carbon dioxide is in the permafrost. We are starting to we're able to measure with things like ground truthing the extent to which that soil is thawing, and that we're seeing that release as well. So there are early indicators that we're able to pick it up, whether it's through ground truthing or whether it's through satellite data. And again, when it comes to the economic impacts of climate change, it wholly depends upon the models that we use. So most models that predict relatively small impacts from climate change generally are top-down integrated assessment models that look at general warming. They don't take into account elements of chronic sea level rise. They rarely take into account elements such as the increased incidence of extreme weather events. They certainly don't take into account second order impacts of migration and conflict, etc., because the impacts of climate change have such, I guess, wide and far-reaching consequences. It's very difficult to model them all. So I think I would probably caveat any attempt to model the full impacts of climate change as something that will almost certainly be incomplete.
Thank you.
It's also true to say the conclusions of that report, Tom, are pretty true, that the US will be the last country to be hit by this in terms of physical damage to the US economy. The US and the UK are at risk of being damaged by mass migration from the countries which are going to be hit a lot sooner. And that report also says that the direct impact, any actions the US takes now won't have a short-term impact. And I think everyone agrees that as well. We're not talking about these things have an instant impact. We're talking about moving now to hopefully mitigate the longer-term risks. And I think we all know the pressure put on US reports and how independent a report by the US Department of Energy might be at the current time, given the current environment over there.
I think you could make that accusation at any scientific report where you're using climate models projecting consequences far into the future. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm not sure how salient that is relative to any other reports we've seen in the last 20 years on potential climate change.
Yeah, but I think it comes back to I don't think we in the UK, even though we're having floods in the UK, we're going to feel the worst effects last. Us and the US, the West is going to feel the effects last. But I think we'll have, before we even get the worst physical effects, I think we'll have mass migration, which we won't be able to stop. That's my view anyway.
No, Bobby, thanks. Billy, you got your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yep. Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. So really good presentation, and I hear what you say about fund managers and investment managers, but I see the world through advisors and real people, and I wonder if you have a view on how this is actually going to affect people at retirement. And for example, do you see an increase in inequality, that the rich can afford air conditioning and that the poor can't? Do you see, perhaps, people moving abroad? Do you see people saying, bugger it, if the world is so bad, I'm not going to put money into a pension, in the first place? And I wonder if you have any views on how it's actually going to affect people's behaviour.
That's a really good question. And I think they're different answers if you answer that at a UK-centric and a global level. So I'll try and do both. I think you are increasingly seeing young people skeptical about pension contribution. I think, although that is partially due to climate doom, I think a lot of that is actually also due to change in demographics and what they actually think pension returns will be in 30, 35, 40 years' time. Economic growth is also one that's hard on that time frame. If you're looking at sort of 35, 40 years, technological trends aside, we do have things that we're looking at, such as peak energy that we might hit. Again, we do have abundant renewables that hopefully we'll see at that time, and nuclear fission. It's like, and there are sort of the wide variety in what different models are showing. But if we're looking at global economic growth on that time frame, we are seeing certain sets of models showing major impacts to global growth and what we'll see as a result, and then what we'll see as sort of pension pots will be worth doing. So I think the asset price and the pension pot question is just, it's hard to answer that question without having spurious accuracy. As to how it's affecting decisions now, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know whether it will lead to people taking their pensions out earlier, whether it's people decide to live in different places. Almost certainly, we're seeing that within countries. For example, if countries like Spain and Italy, you're already seeing people move from hotter parts of the country to cooler parts of the country. We're seeing this relatively substantively actually across the EU. I'd say sort of the first place where I'd imagine would see this most. And then, yeah, from an inequality standpoint, it's a huge issue in terms of how these impacts are managed. So as far as different climate-related natural hazards go, heat waves are expected to be the most killer, and it's the ability to have access to HVAC systems, or failing that, at least natural cooling systems in terms of building design, that make a difference of the impact of heat stress on especially the oldest, who are most vulnerable from a health standpoint. So I think we will see major impacts on the elderly that will be felt, I think, primarily through heat. That's a short answer to your question.
That poses some interesting questions for annuity pricing. I think, sort of postcode and so forth will become, more important. Okay, well, thank you.
Actually, sorry, can I just raise a point on that? Specifically with age and heat, is it not true that older people tend to be killed a lot more by cold weather than by hot weather?
Very much so.
Yes.
So you can't take them off at the top without adding them in at the bottom. So
I haven't seen predicted number of deaths that change when it comes to, I guess, extreme cold. I have seen predicted numbers when it goes to heat, especially amongst the Indian subcontinent, and the expected number of deaths due to heat waves that will extend past wet bulb 35 in very high population dense parts of the world is pretty substantive.
No, I'm talking about the mitigation of the cold in other climates causing less deaths.
Yeah, I haven't seen much that's basically looked at how that will change. What I would say is that even if we're seeing the warming on aggregate, it doesn't necessarily mean, because we're seeing increases in both extreme cold and extreme heat, that we'll necessarily have fewer deaths from extreme cold. Just because we're seeing higher degrees of variability as well as seeing degrees of warming increase.
Okay, interesting. But as I said, it's super useful. You can't look at one without the other, I would say. It's yeah.
Yeah, I think it is true though that as we get more as we get hotter, we actually see extremes of cold increase as well. So that's why we don't expect the deaths from cold to decrease, because cold actually gets worse as well. So it's a bit of we're actually getting hotter and colder at the same time, and not overall getting warmer.
Yeah, I'd probably like to see a bit of evidence on that, to be honest. I'm not fully convinced. I mean, as Tom was saying, you can there seems to be some of the high mountains do seem to be thinning, which suggests they're not getting the cold.
Yeah, well, a lot of this evidence is empirical. You just go around and look what's happening and speak to a farmer. They'll soon tell you they're getting colder winters and hotter summers. And it's and if you look at what the champagne companies have just done in France, they've just bought a load of southern English vineyards because they've already predicted they won't be able to produce champagne within their current business plan lifetime. They need to buy up southern English vineyards because their areas in Champagne are going to be too hot. They won't be able to produce the grapes.
Well, I'm not disagreeing. I mean, although obviously the Romans made wine in the UK as well, but that's an example of it getting warm in the UK rather than being cold in France.
So there are reports, at least as far as the US is concerned, from the American Medical Association and from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that show, at least in the past 10 years, a significant increase in cold-related deaths that we'd seen sort of prior to that.
Natalie, you got your hand raised?
Yeah, I mean, I guess all of this will suggest that the annuity tables or actuarial tables are not right, and they need to be reviewed. And I think that suggests a bigger study. I mean, that to me is a much bigger question, right? And that's something that needs to be is an exercise that, as in pension funds, we should be pushing for, because clearly, I mean, we're all saying the same thing. This is not right. But we don't have the data, and we need to get a clarity in the view. So,
yeah, fewer deaths in Scotland and more in Brighton in the UK case.
but we need to have a better view, because right now we are using the same data. I mean, corrected for COVID, but I mean, we need to have a better clarity on this.
Yeah, there is disaggregated data. So you have heat islands, especially around urban heat. So heat impacts tend to be concentrated around cities, especially where you have building stock that hasn't been designed for high levels of heat, often to be able to do this relatively accurately. We have flood models in the UK at sub sort of 25 by 25 meter resolution. So we can start to look at sort of cyclone risk and flood risk, but those are generally not sort of high mortality events in the UK, at least not yet. So we're probably looking in terms of direct impacts to mortality through extreme heat for the most part. And again, sort of it'd be overlaying those heat maps with the quality of building stock to see where climate-related deaths amongst particular demographics are most likely to occur.
Okay, Sahil. Podrag, you got your hand raised as well?
Yeah, given that we're arguing about minutiae here, the point made about more deaths due to cold than heat may change, given that we've got an increasingly more diabetic global population, and you don't need extreme heat to be dangerous to diabetics. My wife's a type 1. Than you do, then it could be quite mild heat, and the kind of temperatures we've got now can be very dangerous to diabetics. So we've got knock-on effects there as well. So I thought I'd just throw that in the mix and add further confusion.
That's a really good point. I've not seen much that's attempted to disaggregate the impacts of heat by different health conditions. One of the things that is concerning on the health side that I'd also flag is the impact of electrical grid failure that we see due to extreme heat, and then obviously the impacts on hospitals and patients there too, which is also worth flagging.
That's a good question, Podrag. I mean, do you think, Sahil, there should be some more analytics on health conditions and weighting applied, I guess, to the impact?
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth doing. I imagine the Wellcome Trust, I believe, have done some work on it, but I'm not that well acquainted with it.
Okay, cool. I mean, Podrag, if you've got any research, or have you seen any research on health and climate change, that'd be really interesting. So yeah,
I've read bits and pieces, so if I find it, I'll share it with the group.
that'd be great. Brilliant. Sahil, by the way, are you happy for us to share the slides that you've used today? Is that possible?
Yes, I will share the slides, and happy to share slides and contact details. We're happy to help where we can.
That's great. Okay, Dennis, sorry, you got your hand up as well. Do you want to ask a question? You're on mute, Dennis.
Yeah.
I think you might still be muted, Dennis.
Yeah, Dennis, you're mute.
Okay, sorry about that. I mean, this analysis is all about risk analysis, really. You're using risk models to try to make predictions about the future. But isn't the real question one of uncertainty, radical uncertainty, that we're in a situation which we've never been in before, and the risk models can tell us what's happening, but maybe they can't tell us the whole story. I mean, it seems to me, and I think it's obvious to a lot of people, that the climate is manifestly, or the effects of climate change are manifestly being felt. We see them in floods in all over the world. We see them in fires in America, and the effects of habitat loss, loss of one of the causes of migration, I'm sure, is loss of agriculture in some countries, and so on. And isn't the real uncertainty the question of at what point do we realise that something has to be done, and we have to actually stop pumping out carbon into the atmosphere and actually address the issue on a world policy level, and that will lead to things like fossil fuels becoming stranded assets, that pension schemes will no longer be able to invest in fossil fuels because they're no longer worth anything in terms of the planet, and so on. So there's this fundamental question about where the political tipping point is, really. At what point do we reach a tipping point where we suddenly realise that we're in an emergency of an unprecedented type?
There's a lot in there, and some really important points. So yes, this is the short answer to the first part. As I said, climate change has so many different impacts that we see. So I didn't really have the time today, and we don't look at in as much detail nature and biodiversity loss. But associated losses from nature and biodiversity losses are also really stark. And there are a broader range of impacts that I haven't spoken about as much today, which you can attempt to model in more detail. But obviously, it's not just the impacts of the climate itself, but how humans respond. And again, that comes with a huge amount of uncertainty. So yeah, risk models tell us a little bit more about how things may unfold. They're unable to predict the future. As far as the political tipping points go, it's almost impossible to predict. There's a book that I recommend called Ministry of the Future, which I don't want to ruin too much of, but it basically looks at this question in a lot of detail. And there are different theories from whether it would be something like a wet bulb 35 heat wave in South Asia, where we'd see a huge loss of life, right through to major drought that could lead to multiple breadbasket failure, a war that would see across Egypt and Sudan in northern Africa, across India and China. There are all sorts of different hypotheses that people have formed in terms of what it would take. Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. It's a tough one.
But the important thing, Sahil, is that you're talking about it and taking a deep dive into all the, necessary areas and regions that are important to humanity and, the nations. So, it's important stuff, really important stuff. Some of it will happen quicker than we think, and some of it won't. And I think that's the reality of the analysis. But I think it's been really interesting, Sahil. I really, really appreciate your presentation, your input. If anybody wants a copy of the slideshow, then please contact me or Henry or Bobby, and we'll be delighted to share the slideshow with you. And the video of today will be out probably in the next hour or two on Pension Playpen. But Sahil, thank you very much. Can we have some virtual claps for Sahil and some actual claps? Well done. Andrew's put his hand up. I don't know if that's a clap or a hand, Andrew, but Let's say that's a virtual hand clap. There we go. So thank you very much indeed for that, Sahil, and really, really appreciate that. So thanks everyone for joining. I hope you enjoyed today's session. Really, really interesting. Next week we've got Bryn again, Lord Davies of Brixton, and hopefully Tom might join the party. We are talking about a submission to the Pensions Commission 2. Should Playpen submit a white paper or analytics on the Pensions Commission 2? So that should be quite interesting. If you can join us on that, that would be great. I know it's bank holiday, so enjoy your bank holiday weekends, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the week. And Sahil, I really, really appreciate your time and your input. If anybody would like to contact Sahil, then please go through directly to Sahil or to me or Bobby, and we'll put you in touch. But be safe. Let's pray for peace in the East. We're nearly there, we think. And let's pray for peace in the Middle East as well. So thank you very much indeed, everybody, for your time today. Hope you enjoyed the session. Yeah, huge thanks, Sahil, for great input. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks so much
Thank
for having me.
All right. Cheers,
Bye,
everyone.
everyone.
Take care.
Thanks.
Bye. Bye.